2:17 a.m. No wind, no rain, just silence so thick it pressed against the walls of the Varsetti mansion like something alive. Then the motion sensor on the third floor triggered. Not the outer gates, not the perimeter sensors, the interior hallway, east wing, private corridor, the one that led only to a single destination, the Triplet King's bedroom suite. Guard Station 2 caught it first. Darius, the overnight shift lead, leaned toward his monitor. He blinked, rubbed his eye with the back of his knuckle, looked again. The corridor was empty, almost 12 inches from the floor, barely visible on the thermal imaging overlay. Something was moving. Low, slow, deliberate. Darius grabbed his radio. Station 2 to control. You seeing feed 7? A pause. Then, is that a baby? It was. No one spoke for 3 full seconds. The child was small, maybe 10 months, maybe 11. Dressed in a pale yellow sleep suit that had seen better days. No shoes. No carrier. No adult anywhere in the frame. Just this tiny figure, crawling down the most restricted hallway in one of the most protected private estates on the East Coast. Moving like it knew exactly where it was going. Inside the bedroom suite, Riven Varsetti stood at the center table with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and 3 open folders in front of him. Maps, figures, names circled in red. His brother Selim leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, jaw tight. The Caldwell alliance is stalling. 2 weeks of silence means they've already chosen a side. Just not ours. Dorian, the youngest of the 3, sat with his chair reversed, forearms resting on the back of it. Then we stop waiting, move the shipment without their sign-off and let the silence speak for itself. Riven didn't answer. He was looking at the door, because something had knocked on it. Not hard, not loud. 3 small, soft taps, like knuckles that barely had weight behind them. The 3 men exchanged a look that needed no words. Dorian stood, crossed the room, opened the door. The baby looked up at him. Wide brown eyes, round face, a small smear of dried something across one cheek. Completely calm, the way only very young children or very dangerous people can be when they've landed somewhere they intended to reach. Dorian stared. The child stared back. Then the baby lifted one tiny fist and opened it. Something fell against the floor with a soft metallic sound. Riven was already moving. He crouched down, picked it up, held it under the light. Pendant, small, silver, an angular etching on one face, a mark that only one person in the world wore. The room changed. It didn't get louder. It got very, very quiet in the specific way that only happens when 3 people recognize something at the exact same moment and none of them want to be the first to say it out loud. Selim pushed off the wall slowly. That's Soren's. Nobody confirmed it. Nobody had to. Riven turned the pendant over in his palm once. Then again. The baby had gone still, sitting now, watching the 3 of them with that unnerving calm. No crying. No reaching. No fear. Just waiting. And then the child turned its gaze directly to Riven, held it, and lifted both arms, reaching for him specifically. Hi viewers. If a baby showed up at your door in the middle of the night holding something that belonged to someone from your past, what would you do? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Riven didn't move, couldn't, because the weight of that pendant in his hand, and the weight of that child's stare, and the weight of a name none of them had spoken in over a year, all of it hit at once. Soren. The radio in Dorian's hand crackled hard. Darius's voice came through clipped and sharp. Alpha Kings, we have a situation at the main gate. East exterior. Someone's down. Dorian pressed the button. Define down. A beat. Then, collapsed, sir. Male. Barely breathing. Security found him just outside the iron gate. He walked here. Looks like he walked a long way. The baby made no sound. But Riven's hand closed around the pendant so tight the etching pressed into his skin. And for the first time in over a year, the name finally broke the surface. Soren. The rain had stopped hours ago, but Soren Ashby looked like it hadn't. He was on his back in the wet grass just beyond the main gate, one arm folded across his chest, fingers still curled as if he'd been holding something up until the very last second. His clothes, a thin gray jacket, dark jeans with a torn knee, were soaked through. His lips were cracked. His skin was running hot. Not warm, hot. The kind of fever that doesn't ask permission. Guard Darius had already called the estate physician by the time Riven reached the gate on foot. 2 other guards flanked him, hands near their holsters, which was protocol, and which felt wrong in a way Riven didn't examine until later. He crouched down. Soren's eyes were closed. The face hadn't changed much. Leaner, maybe. Sharper along the jaw. A thin scar near the left temple that hadn't been there before. His throat carried the faint scent mark of an unmated omega. Present, but muted, like a signal someone had deliberately tried to suppress. Riven noticed all of it in about 4 seconds. Then he slid one arm beneath Soren's shoulders and another under his knees, and he carried him inside. Selim met them at the east entrance with the physician, Dr. Renata Osei, already gloved and moving. She assessed Soren in the hallway while Riven still held him. Temperature, pulse, hydration, responsiveness, and the assessment wasn't good. Dehydration. Fever's been running at least 6 hours. Foot trauma. He's been walking on a blister the size of a $50 with no padding. Someone needs to tell me how far this person traveled on foot. Dorian was already on his tablet, pulling location data, cross-referencing. His jaw tightened as he read. 11 miles, he said. From the last cell tower ping associated with. He stopped. Looked up. From 11 miles out. On foot. In the dark. The hallway was quiet for a moment. 11 miles. With a baby. Dr. Osei looked at Riven. Get him to the infirmary. Now. Riven moved. Selim walked beside him, not speaking. That was the thing about Selim. When something actually got to him, he went still. Not cold. Still. Like the inside of him needed a moment to catch up to what his eyes were seeing. Once Soren was settled on the infirmary bed and Dr. Osei was running a fluid line, she started talking through her findings in that efficient, no-emotion medical voice she used when the facts were bad enough on their own. He's malnourished. Not starving, but he's been undereating for weeks, possibly longer. The fever is from exhaustion and exposure. His feet are in rough shape but not infected. He'll survive. Riven stood at the foot of the bed. Survive. That word landed differently in a room that had once made a different kind of decision about Soren's future. Dorian had gone to the corner and was reviewing the security footage. Not the interior cameras, but the external ones. The street cameras the Varsetti network pulled from the surrounding 2-mile grid. He looked up once. There are tire tracks on the service road off Lennox, he said. 2 sets. One coming in slow, one leaving fast. Whoever was behind him. They stopped following when he got close enough to the estate lights. That matters. Not rivals who would have pushed further. Not random. Someone who knew exactly where to stop and why. Dr. Osei was adjusting the 4-drip when Selim spoke from near the window. He flinched. The doctor paused. Pardon. When you moved his arm to set the line. He was unconscious, and he flinched. Selim's voice was even, but his eyes stayed on Soren's face. People flinch in their sleep when they've been hit. Repeatedly. Over time. No one answered that. The baby was in the corner of the infirmary, placed in a temporary crib the staff had pulled from storage, wide awake, watching the adults in the room with that same impossible calm from the hallway. Riven looked at the child, then back at the man in the bed. 1 year. More than 1 year of silence, of absence, of a name that went unspoken by unspoken agreement in the Varsetti house. And now Soren had walked 11 miles through the night, carrying this child, following some path only he had mapped, and collapsed 50 feet from the gate. He could have knocked, could have called, could have sent a message through any of 100 channels. He hadn't. He'd walked until his body stopped. And Dr. Osei was already writing up the survival report with that same steady hand when she paused once, briefly, and said, "He'll be conscious within the next few hours. I'd recommend having someone in the room when he wakes." Dorian nodded. But Riven was already looking at the door, at the exits, the angles, the shadows in the corners of the infirmary. Whoever had been behind Soren on that road hadn't come past the estate lights. That didn't mean they were gone. It meant they were patient. And then Soren's eyes opened. Just barely. Just a crack. He looked at the ceiling first, then slowly at the room. And when his gaze landed on Riven, standing at the foot of the bed, his whole body went rigid. Not with relief, with fear. Soren's eyes moved fast. Ceiling. Door. Window. Left corner. Right wall. Back to the door. The way a person scans a room when they've spent enough time in places where the exits mattered more than the furniture. Dr. Osei stepped forward gently. "You're safe. You're inside the Varsetti estate. You came in through the east gate last night." Soren's eyes stopped moving. He found the crib in the corner. Something in his chest visibly released. Not all the way, not completely, but enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to stop gripping the sheet with both hands quite so hard. The baby was awake, standing in the crib with both hands on the railing, watching him. When their eyes met, the child made a small, quiet sound. Not crying, not laughing. Just present. "I'm here. I see you." Soren closed his eyes for 3 seconds. When he opened them again, the triplets were still in the room. Riven at the foot of the bed. Dorian near the door. Selim standing by the window with his arms folded and his expression doing the thing it did when he was working very hard at patience. Dr. Osei placed a notepad and pen on the bed beside Soren's right hand. Standard protocol for a mute patient who'd been brought in without communication devices. Soren looked at the notepad. He did not pick it up. Selim's jaw moved. Just once. Dorian noticed. He stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Selim and the bed without making it obvious. "You don't have to explain anything right now," Dorian said, keeping his voice steady. "Just rest." Soren's eyes went to Dorian, then back to the door. His gaze didn't settle. It tracked. Systematically. Every 3 to 5 seconds, his attention returned to the same 3 points: the main door, the window on the east wall, and the small supply closet in the back left corner. Like he was counting seconds between exits. Selim pushed off the window ledge. "Soren." His voice was measured, but the edge was there, just barely contained. "We need to understand what happened. We need to know who was following you. We need." "Selim." Riven's voice. Quiet. Flat. Selim stopped. Riven hadn't moved from the foot of the bed. He hadn't said anything since Soren woke up. Just stood there, watching, the way Riven always watched things, like he was collecting information the room didn't know it was giving. He spoke now only because Selim was about to push, and Riven understood something the other two didn't yet want to accept. Soren wasn't refusing to communicate. He was deciding whether it was safe to. That was different. Very different. "Give him the room," Riven said. Selim looked at him sharply. "Give him the room," Riven repeated. Not louder. Just final. Dr. Osei quietly gathered her chart and stepped out. Dorian followed. Selim held the stare with Riven for exactly 2 seconds, then exhaled through his nose and walked out, pulling the door most of the way shut behind him. Riven stayed. He pulled the chair from against the wall, placed it beside the bed. Not close enough to crowd, not far enough to dismiss, and sat down. He didn't speak. Soren watched him. Riven watched back. The silence lasted almost 4 minutes. Long enough that most people would have broken it. Riven didn't. And slowly, the constant door-checking slowed down. Soren's grip on the sheet loosened. His breathing deepened by a fraction. In the crib, the baby had sat back down and was quietly examining its own fingers with great seriousness. Finally, Soren looked at the notepad. He reached for it. Riven didn't react. Didn't lean forward. didn't change his posture at all. Soren picked up the pen, held it over the paper, and then put it back down. His hand didn't shake. That was the thing. It wasn't fear that stopped him. It was something else. Something calculated. He'd made a decision and then unmade it in the span of 3 seconds, and whatever the reasoning was, it lived entirely behind his eyes. The baby pulled itself upright in the crib again, looked at Riven, then crawled to the crib railing and held out one small hand, reaching directly toward him, the same gesture from the hallway the night before. Riven looked at the child, then at Soren. Soren was watching him now with an expression that held something complicated in it. Not hostility, not warmth, something in between that had seen too many outcomes to commit to either. And then a knock at the door. Dorian cracked it open. "Security needs you both." His voice was controlled in the specific way it got when the news was bad. They pulled external footage. Something was on the tree line. East side. Last 3 nights. Riven stood. He looked at Soren once more. Soren's eyes had already gone back to the door. Counting. Still counting. The footage was 17 minutes long. Covered 3 separate nights. 3 separate positions along the tree line that ran parallel to the east perimeter wall. Whoever had held those positions had known exactly where the camera blind spots were, or close enough to it that the difference barely showed. Head of security, Marcus Jewell, ran it twice before calling the triplets in. He was a careful man by nature, which was why the Varsetti Kings trusted him. He didn't bring things to the war room unless he was certain of what he was presenting. He was not certain of this. "The vehicles," he said, pulling up the street footage from the Lennox service road, match 2 plates from the city grid, both registered to a logistics company called Ardent Supply. Smaller outfit, mid-tier contracts, nothing that touches our territory directly. Selim leaned over the table. "But," Marcus set his jaw. "But when we ran the access history on those plates through the Metro commercial grid, one of them shows clearance tags. Not police. Not city." He let that sit for a moment. "Private clearance," he said. "The kind that comes from a network with institutional backing." Dorian straightened. Riven was already looking at something else, the second monitor, where the surveillance team had been running a parallel trace. "Not on the vehicles. On the data. Show them the file access log," Riven said. Marcus pulled it up. It was a timestamp record from the Varsetti internal data system. Administrative files. Specifically personal records. Employee and affiliate files. Specifically Soren's file. "Someone accessed it 14 days ago," Marcus said. "From inside the network. Active clearance, active session key. Not a breach. This was someone who already had access. The room absorbed that. Not a rival syndicate running reconnaissance from the outside. Not a city authority pulling records through legal channels. Someone inside the Varsetti network had opened Soren's file 2 weeks ago, cross-referenced his last known location. And within 3 days of that access, vehicles had appeared in the tree line." Selim's voice came out carefully. "What level clearance?" "Level 3 administrative." Dorian looked at Marcus. "How many people hold that?" 42 active users in the system. "But level 3 with access to personal affiliate records." Marcus clicked. A shorter list appeared on screen. 11. 11 people. 11 names, any one of which could have pulled that file and handed Soren's location to whoever had been following him through the dark. Riven studied the list without expression. He knew every name on it. That was the problem. These weren't strangers. These weren't contractors brought in off the street. These were people who had sat at dinners, been trusted with logistics, moved inside the Varsetti estate with access that took years to earn. Empires rarely collapse because of enemies. They collapse because of the people trusted to guard the doors. "Pull communications records on all 11, Riven said. 40 days back. Cross-reference against the Ardent Supply Registry and any third-party accounts associated with the company." Marcus nodded and turned back to his station. Dorian was quiet beside him. thinking something through. Then, Soren knew this was coming, didn't he? He didn't run when they started following him, he calculated. He picked a destination. Nobody argued with that. Riven turned from the monitor. He walked back toward the infirmary. Alone this time. When he pushed the door open, Dr. Osei was gone, checking on the baby down the hall. Soren was upright in the bed. He'd eaten half a cup of broth from the tray on the bedside table, which the doctor had noted was a good sign. The notepad was on the table. The pen was in his hand. He looked up when Riven entered. Riven sat down. He didn't say anything about what they'd just found in the war room. Didn't explain, didn't interrogate, didn't place the weight of 11 names on a sick man in an infirmary bed. He just sat. And Soren, after a long moment, looked down at the notepad. The pen moved. 3 words. He tore the sheet free and held it out. Riven took it. He read it once. Then he read it again. 3 words, written in Soren's careful, deliberate handwriting. Still inside here. Riven looked up. Soren was watching him with that same unreadable expression, the one that had lived somewhere between wariness and exhaustion for the entire morning. But his hand was steady now. He'd chosen to write this. That meant something. Riven folded the paper once and placed it in his breast pocket. He stood, crossed to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, looked back once. Soren had already returned his gaze to the window, watching the tree line with the same quiet, methodical attention he'd given the exits. Still inside here. 2 words that meant the threat hadn't come from outside. And 1 word, here, that confirmed something that made the back of Riven's neck go cold. The person who pulled that file, who handed Soren's location to whoever had been parked in that tree line for 3 nights, was still inside the Varsetti estate. Right now, Dorian didn't sleep. He went back to the security station at 4 in the morning and asked for the raw footage. Not the edited clip Marcus had compiled for the briefing, but the original uncut recordings from the internal cameras. The ones that covered the full estate going back 72 hours. He wasn't looking for the intruder. He was looking at the baby. Specifically, the path the child had taken. He pulled the FIRS motion flag from the previous night and ran it frame by frame. The baby had entered the camera's range at the north end of the 3rd floor corridor. The nearest staircase from the guest level below was 17 meters to the west. That meant the child had already been moving in a specific direction before it ever reached the main hallway. No wandering, no doubling back, no pauses at corners the way a child who was lost would pause, uncertain, looking both ways, recalibrating. Just a direct line, toward the Triplet's bedroom suite. Dorian sat back. He pulled up the scent ventilation schematic for the 3rd floor, the estate's climate system, which ran on a zone circulation model that the engineering team had updated 2 years ago. Clean air in, stale air out. Each zone pulled from a primary source point. The primary source point for the East Wing 3rd floor was the Triplet suite. Their personal scent markers. The ambient alpha signature that accumulated in private space over years of habitation, circulated outward from that room through the vent system. Faintly, imperceptibly to most, but not to a child trained to recognize it. Dorian stared at the schematic for a long time. Then he went to the infirmary. Soren was awake. He seemed to sleep in short intervals, an hour, maybe 2, and then wake with that same immediate scanning alertness, like a switch that had no gradual setting. Off or fully on. The baby was on the bed beside him, sitting upright, occupied with the hem of Soren's sleeve. Dorian pulled up a chair. He didn't bring notes, didn't bring the schematic, just sat with the understanding of what he'd worked out and held it in front of Soren without formality. You taught the baby our scent, he said. Not a question. Soren looked at him, still, waiting to see where this went. The child didn't wander into our wing by accident. Followed a trail. You trained it, deliberately, to find us by scent signature. Dorian kept his voice even, without accusation or sentiment. The only reason you do that is if you thought there was a possibility you wouldn't make it here yourself. The baby, oblivious to the weight of the moment, tugged on Soren's sleeve with great determination. Soren watched Dorian for another 3 seconds. Then he reached for the notepad. He wrote 2 lines, held it up. Dorian read, "If I didn't wake up outside your gate, she would have come in anyway, and she would have found you. Dorian looked at the baby, then back at Soren. "You planned for your own death," he said. Quiet, not horrified, something quieter than horror. He thought about that for a moment, about what it took to build that kind of contingency. Not in a moment of panic, but in advance. To look at a child you were responsible for and decide, I need to train this baby to survive without me. And I need to trust that the people I'm sending her to are worth trusting. After everything, after the exile, after the silence, after whatever year Soren had spent on the outside of gates like this one, he'd still trusted them enough to send the baby here. Dorian looked at his hands. That information pressed on something in his chest that he didn't have immediate language for. The door opened. Selim entered, saw the 2 of them, read the room in about 2 seconds, and pulled a chair to the opposite side of the bed. He sat without speaking, which was unusual enough that Soren noticed it. Then Selim said, "She's healthy. The baby." Dr. Osei confirmed. Something shifted in Soren's posture at that. A small release, real and involuntary. Then Riven came in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the arrangement. All 3 of them flanking the infirmary bed like some kind of accidental vigil, and then he walked in and stood at the foot. The 4 of them in one room, which hadn't happened in over a year. The baby looked at each of the triplets in turn. Slowly, deliberately, then she clapped. Once. Hard enough to make a real sound in the quiet room. And despite everything, despite the footage in the war room, despite the 11 names on the access list, despite 3 nights of surveillance from the tree line and the folded paper in Riven's breast pocket, Selim laughed. Short, surprised, real. And then it faded, because Selim leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and asked the question that had been sitting in the room since the moment the infirmary door opened. Who was hunting you? Soren's face didn't change. He looked at Selim for a long time. Then he looked at Riven. Then Dorian. Then, slowly, he reached for the notepad. He wrote. He tore the paper free. And he held it face down against the blanket for a moment, just a moment, like he was deciding one last time. Then he turned it over. For words. You're not ready yet. The baby clapped again. Nobody laughed this time. The timestamp read 11:42 p.m. Marcus Jewell had been staring at it for 40 minutes before he called Riven in. Not because he didn't understand what he was looking at, because he understood it too well, and he needed to be certain before he said it out loud. The file was old, 14 months old, buried in the administrative archive under a case reference number that had been closed, stamped, and filed the same week Soren was exiled from the Varsetti estate. The original accusation, theft of operational data, leaking internal logistics to a competing network. That was the charge. That was the reason Soren had been removed, quietly, quickly, without public process, from the only home he'd known for 3 years. Marcus had gone back to the primary evidence, the data transfer log that had been submitted as proof. He ran it through the verification system. The result came back in under 2 minutes. Flagged. The transfer log, Marcus said carefully, carries a valid timestamp on the surface, but when you check the metadata embedded in the original file, the server-side trace, the timestamp was written after the file was created. Riven looked at the screen. Someone created the file, Marcus continued, then backdated the timestamp to make it look like the transfer happened 3 days before the accusation was made. Selim had gone very still. Dorian was leaning over Marcus's shoulder, reading the verification output line by line. The accusation was fabricated, Dorian said. Not a question. Marcus nodded once. The evidence that exiled Soren was planted. I can't tell you yet by who. But the data was manufactured. He didn't leak anything. The war room was quiet in the specific way of a room absorbing something that can't be taken back. 14 months. Soren had spent 14 months outside. Malnourished, hunted, alone with a baby he'd trained to find them in case he died. For something that never happened. Power makes decisions quickly. Regret takes longer to arrive. Selim walked to the far end of the table and stood there with his back to the room. Not hiding anything. Just needing 2 feet of distance between himself and everything else. Dorian put his hand flat on the table. Said nothing. Riven was still looking at the screen. He thought about the infirmary. About the way Soren's eyes had gone straight to the exits. About the flinch. About 11 miles in the dark with a baby. About a man who had still, despite all of it, trained his child to come to them. Pull the communication records of the original accuser, Riven said. His voice was even, carefully even. Cross-reference against the file creation date and the 3 days before the accusation was submitted. Marcus was already moving. The records loaded in 3 columns. 40 days of communication logs for one Terrence Whitmore, mid-level operations coordinator. 7 years with the Varsetti network, clean record, no prior flags. Marcus filtered the relevant window. 6 outgoing contacts in the 48 hours before the accusation. 5 were internal. Standard. The 6th was external. An account that came back to a shell company. Marcus ran the shell company. It dissolved after 30 days. But before it dissolved, it received 1 transfer. 1 payment. To an account held by Terrence Whitmore. The amount was significant. Not astronomical. Significant. Enough to mean the job had been planned in advance and the payment was structured to look like a consulting fee. Dorian exhaled slowly through his nose. Selim turned back around. Riven closed the folder and picked up his phone. And then Marcus's second monitor pinged. He leaned toward it. The color in his face shifted just slightly. Enough that Riven noticed. What? Riven said. Marcus turned the monitor toward them. The payment to Whitmore's account. The one from the dissolved shell company had originated from a wire transfer. The wire transfer had a source account. Marcus pointed at the account number. That's a Varsetti executive account, he said. Internal. Restricted access. He paused. It belongs to Aldous Crane. Nobody moved. Aldous Crane. 22 years inside the Varsetti network. Senior executive advisor. The man who had sat in the chair to the right of the king's table at every major council session for longer than Dorian had been running operations. Gray at the temples now. Measured voice. The kind of person who handed you a folder and waited with that patient expression while you read it. Trusted. Completely. That word now felt like a stone dropped into standing water. Riven did not react outwardly. That was important to note. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't pace. Didn't slam anything against the table. He stood completely still for a long 5 seconds. And then he said quietly, "Where is Crane right now?" Marcus checked. Evening briefing finished 2 hours ago. He signed out of the building at 9:47. Should be in his East Corridor quarters. Should be, Selim said. Should be, Marcus confirmed. That distinction meant everything. Dorian pulled his phone and started moving. Not toward Crane's quarters, not yet. Toward the infirmary. He needed to tell Soren before they moved on anything. Not out of courtesy. Out of strategy. Soren had written "You're not ready yet." Meaning there was more. Something they still didn't know. Moving on Crane without the full picture was the kind of decision that blew up in rooms. Riven caught his arm before he reached the door. "Don't tell him what we found," Riven said. "Ask him what he's been protecting." Dorian held the look, then nodded. He went down the corridor alone. The infirmary lights were dimmed for the night. Dr. Osei had set the baby in the small crib in the corner. Finally asleep, one fist pressed against her cheek. Soren was upright in bed, not sleeping. He rarely seemed to sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch. He looked up when Dorian entered. Dorian sat down. He didn't rush it. "We've been going through the original evidence," he said. "From 14 months ago." Soren's eyes didn't move off him. "We found inconsistencies." Dorian kept his voice neutral, not performing neutrality, actually holding it. The data transfer log was fabricated. The timestamp was backdated. He paused. "Someone paid to have you exiled, and we're working out the chain." Soren sat with that information. He didn't look surprised. That was significant. He'd known or suspected for a long time. Dorian leaned forward slightly. "What else do you know? Not what you think. What you actually know." Soren reached for the notepad. He wrote for longer this time. Not 3 words. A full paragraph. He tore the page and handed it to Dorian. Dorian read it. Twice. Then he stood, folded the page, and walked back to the war room at a pace that was not quite running. In the infirmary, Soren's eyes went back to the doorway. Watching. The baby shifted in the crib. A small sound, then settled back into sleep. Soren watched the door for another minute. Then his gaze moved, slowly, to the supply closet in the back left corner. The one he'd been tracking since he woke up. It hadn't moved since morning, but it was dark inside. And Soren, who had spent 14 months learning to trust the things that stayed still for too long, felt the hair on the back of his neck rise with the particular clarity of a person who had been right about bad situations before. He didn't reach for the call button. He reached for the pen and wrote one line on the corner of the notepad. Just one. He's close now. He folded it. Set it where anyone entering the room would find it immediately. Then he pulled the baby's crib as close to his bed as the wheels would allow. And waited. The power went out at 1:09 a.m. Not the full estate. The backup generators caught the main grid in under 4 seconds. But those 4 seconds were enough. The security grid, which ran on primary power before the backup transfer, went dark. For 90 seconds, the camera feeds dropped. 90 seconds of nothing. Marcus hit the alert the moment the grid came back up. He was already running the diagnostic when his earpiece fired. Movement. Infirmary corridor. East wing. He pulled up the feed. The corridor was empty. He pulled up the previous 90 seconds. The backup system had captured 5 frames per second on local storage, low quality but present. Frame 11. The figure. Dark clothing. Moving fast along the wall, using the shadow cast by the emergency lighting strip near the floor. Frame 23. At the infirmary door. Frame 31. Inside. Marcus was already on the radio. Dorian Infirmary. Now. Dorian was closer than anyone. He hit the door at a run. The room had been rearranged. That was the first thing he clocked. The baby's crib was pulled flush against Soren's bed, and Soren was standing. Pressed against the wall beside it with a metal 4-stand gripped in both hands like he'd been prepared to use it. In the far corner, near the supply closet, a figure in dark clothing was pulling back toward the window. Dorian crossed the room in 3 steps. The figure moved fast. Trained. They went low and sideways, catching Dorian's first grab and redirecting. A strike to his forearm. Another to his ribs. Dorian absorbed both. He was bigger and he'd absorbed worse, and got a hand on the attacker's collar before the window latch gave way. The figure wrenched free. Gone. Out the window and into the dark before Dorian could get a second grip. He stood there for 2 seconds, breathing, then turned to the room. Soren hadn't moved from the wall. Baby pressed against his chest now. Awake, eyes wide, completely silent in the way children sometimes go silent when the adults around them are broadcasting something that overrides normal noise. Soren was looking at the floor near the supply closet. Something had been dropped during the struggle. A brown envelope. Unsealed. Several pages spilled out across the tile. Dorian crouched down. He didn't touch them, not yet. He read what was visible. Medical records. The baby's. Developmental records. Birth date. physical markers. Someone had compiled a complete file on the child. Not from any Varsetti system, the letterhead was from a private medical registry that Dorian didn't immediately recognize. Fear becomes sharper when innocence is involved. He looked up at Soren. The baby was the target, he said. Soren's arms tightened around the child. Not confirmation. Confirmation wasn't needed. Marcus reached the room 2 minutes later with 2 guards and a forensics kit. He began processing the dropped documents without a word. Riven arrived 60 seconds after that. He assessed the room, assessed Soren, assessed the baby. Then he looked at the documents on the floor. Get an ID on that figure, he told Marcus. I want every frame of those 90 seconds rebuilt and enhanced. Every frame. Marcus nodded and started talking into his radio. Riven crossed to Soren. He didn't say anything about the 4 stand, still gripped in one hand. Didn't ask about the injury. Soren had a fresh bruise rising along his left forearm, likely from bracing against something in the dark. He looked at him for a moment, then reached out, slowly, and placed one hand on the baby's back. Just for a second, the baby blinked at him, then grabbed his finger. Riven didn't pull back. From the doorway, Selim was watching, one hand pressed flat against the frame, and for a moment, in the low emergency light, something passed across his face that wasn't strategy or suspicion or controlled calm. Marcus turned from his station. Alpha Riven. His voice was careful. We have a partial ID on the figure. Everyone looked at him. The access code used to disable the primary grid during the outage, the manual override. He paused, checked the screen once more. Like he was giving himself one last second to be wrong. He wasn't wrong. It was registered to one of the 3 of you. Nobody spoke. The word registered sat in the room like something dropped from a great height. Selim's face went blank. The kind of blank that comes right before something breaks through it. Dorian had gone very still. Riven was already looking at Marcus. Which account? Marcus pulled it up. Read the screen. Looked at Riven. Yours, sir. A beat. Riven said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then, when was the last time I used that code manually? Marcus checked. 11 months ago, during the Northeast grid maintenance. And tonight, the override was initiated from a secondary terminal in the East utility room. Marcus met his eyes. Your credentials were used, but the terminal itself, you weren't there. We have camera confirmation you were in the war room when the grid went down. The relief in the room was not complete. Because someone had Riven's credentials. Someone inside the estate had stored them, held them, and used them tonight. Specifically tonight, when Soren was in the infirmary and the baby was asleep 20 feet from the window. That was not coincidence. That was a plan. Riven turned to Soren. Soren was sitting on the edge of the bed now, baby settled in his lap. He'd watched the entire exchange without expression, but his hand was resting on the notepad. Riven crossed the room and sat down beside him. Not across from him. Beside him. I need everything, Riven said. Quiet. Just the 2 of them, barely. Not when you're ready. Now. Because whoever is doing this just tried to take her. And they'll try again before morning if we don't move first. Soren looked at him. A long look. The kind that measures something. The kind that costs something to give. Then he picked up the pen. He wrote for almost 3 minutes. He wrote about the council meeting he'd accidentally accessed 14 months ago, 2 weeks before his exile. A closed session he hadn't been invited to. He'd pulled the wrong file from the server, a clerical error, and found minutes from a meeting that should not have existed. A vote, not about operations, about succession, about removing the Triplet Kings and restructuring the Varsetti network under a new authority model. A council of 6 with rotating control, eliminating the Alpha King structure entirely. The coup hadn't been designed to destroy the Varsetti Empire. It had been designed to absorb it. Soren had been exiled before he could tell them what he'd found. Because someone in that meeting had seen the server access log and moved immediately. Dorian read over Riven's shoulder as the pages filled. Then came the section that changed the shape of everything. Soren wrote, "The coup didn't start with Crane. Crane was the instrument. The person who organized the council vote, who funded Whitmore, who has been running the internal operation for 2 years. That person is still active. Still holding a position. I have their name. I have documentation. I've had it for 8 months. I didn't come to you with it before because I needed to know which of you I could trust with it." He stopped writing, looked at Riven, then continued, "I watched which of you carried Mira to the infirmary the first night. I watched who sat with her when she cried at 3 in the morning without being asked. I watched who checked the exits before they checked the monitors." He paused again. "I needed to know if you were still the people worth trusting with the truth." Riven read that line twice. Then Soren turned to the last page of what he'd written. One name. He held it out. Riven took it. He read it. He passed it to Dorian. Dorian read it. Said nothing. Passed it to Selim. Selim read it. He looked up. His jaw tightened. Once. Then he exhaled. "I need 10 minutes, Selim said. Nobody asked him what for. Because the name on that page. The name of the person who had been sitting at their table, advising their decisions, and running a silent operation to dismantle their entire power structure from the inside, was someone they all knew. Personally. Completely. And the room was silent with the weight of what that meant. Forgiveness is not owed just because someone regrets hurting you. Riven looked at Soren. "I'm sorry," he said. Simple. No preamble. No explanation attached. Just the words. Placed on the table between them like something that couldn't be taken back and wasn't trying to be. Soren looked at him. He didn't write anything. He didn't nod. He just looked. And then he pulled Mira a little closer and looked at the door, still watching the exits. Even now, the removal was quiet. No confrontation in the war room. No public accusation in front of the full staff. Just a closed meeting 3 hours before dawn, in a room with no cameras and no record in the official log. The person whose name had been on that page sat across the table from the 3 kings for exactly 22 minutes. Then they left the estate. They did not come back. What happened in those 22 minutes was never discussed outside the room. Not by the kings, not by Marcus, not by anyone who might have been in the adjacent hallway. It was the kind of removal that powerful organizations execute precisely because they can afford to clean, contained, irreversible. The estate resumed its normal schedule by 6 in the morning. Mira slept through all of it. Over the next 2 weeks, the Varsetti network quietly restructured 3 administrative positions. 7 access clearances were revoked and reissued. The internal communication logs from the previous 18 months were audited line by a team that reported only to Riven. Terrence Whitmore was contacted. His cooperation was requested. Given the alternatives, he cooperated. The Shell Company trail was documented and sealed. And through all of it, Soren remained in the infirmary. Not because he was too injured to move. Dr. Osei cleared him for full mobility at the end of day 4. He could walk. He could go wherever he chose. No one had locked the door. He stayed because leaving required making a decision he hadn't made yet. Riven didn't ask him to decide. Neither did Dorian. Selim asked once, early on the 3rd day, and then didn't ask again. He wasn't good at waiting. But he was learning what waiting meant to a person who had spent 14 months making every decision from a defensive position. It was Mira who moved first, as she always did. On the morning of day 11, she pulled herself upright using the crib railing, looked at the open door to the infirmary, and took 4 unsteady steps in that direction before sitting down hard on the tile. She looked at the fall, looked at her hands, clapped, and then crawled the rest of the way out the door. Soren was on his feet immediately, following her down the corridor with the unhurried alertness of a person who'd learned that Myra's navigation instincts were usually better than anyone gave her credit for. She led him to the East Wing common room, where the triplets were already gathered over the morning briefing. Mira crawled directly to the center of the floor, positioned herself between the four of them, and sat. She looked at Riven. She looked at Selim. She looked at Dorian. She looked at Soren. Then she held out both arms, one toward the triplets, one back toward Soren, and made the demanding, insistent sound of a child who has identified exactly what she wants and does not understand why adults are so slow about providing it. She wanted them all in the same place. She had always wanted them in the same place. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Selim crouched down first. Reluctantly, with full awareness of how it looked, and a complete inability to remain standing once Mira had deployed that particular expression. He settled cross-legged on the floor. Mira approved. She climbed immediately onto his knee. Dorian sat down next to him without ceremony. Riven stayed standing a moment longer, then sat. Soren was still in the doorway, watching, the way he always watched, measuring exits, measuring distances. Only this time, the thing he was measuring wasn't the distance to the door. It was the distance across the floor. He crossed it, sat down, not beside the triplets. Among them, the briefing folder stayed on the table. Nobody reached for it. And in the war room of the Varsetti estate, the room where decisions got made that moved entire pieces of a city. For people and one small child sat on the floor in the morning light, and the only sound was Mira commentating on everything with great authority and zero recognizable words. Trust rarely returns the way it once existed. But sometimes people rebuild something stronger from the ruins. It lasted about 8 minutes. Then Marcus appeared in the doorway. He held a tablet. His expression was the expression of a man who had hoped, very much, to have a different morning. Alpha Kings. He paused. Looked at Soren once, a brief, specific look, and then back at Riven. Security delivered the final trace on the funding source. Riven looked up. The operation, the council vote, the planted evidence, the exile, the surveillance, all of it was funded upstream. What we dismantled, Marcus set the tablet on the table without drama, was not the source. It was a layer. The room changed. Mira stopped commentating. Someone else funded the coup, Marcus said. Someone outside the network. Outside the city, possibly. We have a transaction trail, partial, intentionally fragmented, but it leads to an entity we've never crossed before. Dorian reached for the tablet. He looked at the name on the screen. He set it down slowly. How long have they known about us? Selim asked. Based on the transaction history? Marcus said. At least 3 years. 3 years. Before the exile. Before the accusation. Before any of this had a shape they could recognize. Riven looked at Soren. Soren was already looking at him. And the thing in his expression wasn't fear anymore. It wasn't the scanning, exit counting, defensive calculation of a man who had spent 14 months surviving. It was something older than that. Something that had been waiting specifically to be useful. He reached for the notepad, wrote one line, slid it across the floor to Riven. I know who they are. I've known for 6 months. That's what I was protecting. Riven read it, read it again, looked at Soren. Somewhere in the estate, Mira had found a pen and was marking the floor with it, fully satisfied with her morning. And in the war room, the 3 kings and the silent Omega they had once exiled looked at each other across the remnants of a trust that had been shattered and then, slowly, painfully, imperfectly, rebuilt into something that didn't look like what it was before. It looked like what it needed to be now. Something built for what was coming next. If you made it to the end of this story, that means something. Stories like this one exist because real loyalty, real betrayal, and real redemption don't always look the way we expect them to. Sometimes the person who comes back isn't looking for an apology. They're looking to see if you became someone worth coming back to. If the story moved you, share it. Leave a comment. Tell someone what part hit different. And if you want to be here when the next story drops, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every chapter is built for people who think deeply, feel fully, and aren't afraid of a story that doesn't take shortcuts. The next story is already coming, and it starts somewhere you won't expect.